Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fourth installment of Stigma-Free Learning Live with the Stigma-Free Society. Thank you so much for tuning in once again to this bi-weekly Facebook and YouTube live event where I dive into some of the lesson plans and downloadable resources that you can find on the Student Mental Health Toolkit with the Stigma-Free Society. So for those of you who are new here, welcome. We are so happy to have you. This is a very new live event still for Stigma-Free, so all viewership is so welcome and so exciting for us. So before we dive into the event and the content of today's video, I'm just going to give you a bit more background on me and on the Stigma-Free Society in case you're new here or in case you just want to hear it all again. So once again, my name is Samara Liberman. I am a programs manager here at the Stigma-Free Society. I have a bachelor's degree in equity studies, and I have a master's degree in teaching, and I have a professional development certification in early years mental health. So the Stigma-Free Society is a decade-old Canadian registered charity that is dedicated to eliminating and reducing stigma of all kinds with a focus on mental health. And one of the primary ways we do this work at the Stigma-Free Society is by using education. We firmly believe, and I personally believe, that education is one of the most important and effective ways that we can educate people on different identities and the ways that we can, stop judging each other and learn to accept and love and appreciate all the beautiful nuances that exist in all of us. So one of the ways that we're going to do that is through this live event. So today we are going to be unpacking another one of the lesson plans that is on the Student Mental Health Toolkit. So if you would like to follow along with today's lesson, you can go on to the Student Mental Health Toolkit, which is free to access for everyone. So if you're an educator, if you're a school counselor, if you're a parent, if you are a guardian, or somebody who's just interested in learning more about youth mental health, stigma, any of these topics, you can access these amazing resources that you'll find on the Student Mental Health Toolkit. So the lesson that we're going to be looking at today is for grades 8 to 12. So this is the lesson that corresponds with the one that we did on the last episode of Stigma-Free Learning Live for grades 4 to 7. And the lesson is called Thinking Outside the Box, Reframing Learning Disabilities. So as I said last week, for those of you who tuned in or for those of you who didn't, a little bit more background on me, I actually have two learning disabilities. I have dyslexia and dyscalculia. So this lesson plan and the one that I went into last week are very near and dear to my heart. I think it's really important that we really shift the way that we see learning disabilities. So some people prefer the term diverse abilities because it can be really empowering for people to understand disability in a different way. So rather than saying disability, we say diverse ability. And that just shows that even though I might have a brain that works slightly differently than most people's brains, it doesn't mean that I'm any less than. So my abilities might be different, but they are not less. So I think that's an important thing to consider for this lesson, and definitely something to bring into the conversation with your students around this lesson. So before we dive in, I really want to encourage you, if you are tuning into this event, if you are a regular viewer, to give us some feedback. Really, we want to be creating content that you will use, that you will watch, that you will enjoy, and that you find value in. So if there is something that we are doing that you really love or something that we could be doing differently, we really, really, really love that feedback, and it helps us do more to serve you. You are the ones that are using these lessons and educating your students on these really important topics, and we want to serve you better. So please feel free to leave a comment on this video of different content areas that you would like to see, ways that we can improve what we're already doing, or new ideas that you may have for us. We are so open to any feedback that you have, and we really encourage you to do that. All right, so let's dive into the lesson. So, like I said, I have a learning disability. I have two learning disabilities, actually. So I feel like it's really exciting for me to be talking with you through this lesson today because it's very close to my heart, and it's something that I have had to shift my own thinking around throughout the years. So I actually have a lot of self-stigma, had previously, still to this day a little bit, of self-stigma around my learning disabilities. For a long time, I really struggled with my academics and how I saw myself as a student. And even going into being a teacher, I really struggled with how do I, as somebody with this kind of different brain, how do I, go into a classroom and teach students in a way that is going to work for me and for them. So I really am excited to talk you through this today, because I think it's something that we can all do, is reshift our thinking about how we see people with learning disabilities and how we see people with different needs and different abilities across the board. So it is important to remember that while not all disabilities are visible, like learning disabilities, for example, they can really profoundly impact your students. So that's another piece to think about today, is what students do you have in your classrooms who might have different learning needs, and how can you support them differently? So this lesson is really to help your students see that individuals with learning disabilities can be extremely successful. So what they're going to do in the active portion of this lesson is they're going to research famous people who have learning disabilities. I think something that's really cool to think about is that, like I said, some disabilities are not visible. So there might be people that they know, or people that are famous who have a disability that they never would have known about or thought about. And I think it's really important for them to see that everyone can be successful, even if you have a brain that's wired slightly differently. So I think that's a really cool way for them to start reframing their thinking, and I think that can really help reduce and eliminate some of the stigma that exists around disabilities and learning disabilities specifically. So with this lesson, your students will be faced with some potential unconscious biases. Sorry, let me try that again. Unconscious biases, I said that a bit weird, and preconceptions that might exist for them surrounding learning disabilities, and they're going to be encouraged to reframe their thinking about learning disabilities and the people who have them. So this goes over the curriculum areas in this portion of the lesson. So this is a social studies and English language lesson, and the social studies curriculum does break off in grade 12 and goes into different areas of social studies that are more specific. So this is aligned with the BC curriculum. I just want to make that clear. We are looking to potentially expand these resources to other provinces, but right now we are focusing primarily on BC. So if you are a BC educator, this curriculum is perfectly aligned for you. So like I said, grade 12 social studies breaks off, but you can still use this for grade 12 students in a social studies context, because it is very relevant to the social studies curriculum across the board. And it's also an English language lesson. So the main focus of the social studies curriculum competencies are around the research component. And then later on in the lesson, after they've done research on the celebrity they've chosen, they will be delivering a presentation to the class. And that is where the English language component comes in. So when you begin the lesson, I would like you to start by prompting your students to reflect on what they already know about learning disabilities. You can open up a dialogue about what learning disabilities they know, what they know about them, and, what preconceptions they might currently have about learning disabilities and people who have learning disabilities. With this discussion, however, it's very important to make sure that you have already facilitated a safe space in your classroom. So this can be a pretty heavy subject for people, especially people who have diagnosed learning disabilities. So I really think it's important that you hone in on the fact that language is key, and that your students who have learning disabilities feel safe in this conversation. So if you think that your class might not be ready to have this conversation about preconceptions or assumptions, and that people who have learning disabilities in your class might not feel safe or might be triggered by this conversation, I think maybe best to move past that piece of the conversation and just focus on what they know about learning disabilities, like the real facts about them, without any of their potential judgments or preconceptions coming into the conversation. So the first piece of the lesson is a video. So it's a very brief video, and it's really just to kind of start thinking about the ways that we can see disability differently. So it's called Seeing Dyslexia Differently. And while this video focuses specifically on dyslexia, a lot of the content in the video is very easily transferable to all learning disabilities. So when the video is done, once you finish watching the video, start again the dialogue around the topics that, you've already discussed by asking those guiding questions that are on the lesson plan. And during the conversation, I would recommend that you write this stuff down on the board. So I think it's a really great way to anchor the conversation and for the students to refer back to what they have already discussed later on when they're writing their research report and doing their presentation, and just to continue to show them how their thinking may be changing throughout the course of this lesson. So I would suggest that on one side of the board you write all of their preconceptions or all the things that they thought might be true about learning disabilities and people who have learning disabilities. And then on the other side of the board, you can continually write down their reframing and their rethinking as they go through this lesson. So you can start by doing that after they watch the video. So what did they think before? What do they think now? Has their thinking changed already? So next, you're going to discuss the concept. I really want you to start thinking about stigma and really start the conversation around stigma with your students. So you can direct their attention to, the preconceptions and the assumptions that you've already written on the board and explain to them that that's how stigma starts. We have all these, preconceptions or assumptions or judgments about other people because we don't understand them. So, if you don't know somebody with a learning disability, you might think a certain way about them because you've never you've never interacted with somebody who has one, or you might just have these preconceptions or these judgments already in place, and that's how stigma is created, and that's how stigma is maintained. So one of the ways that we can start overcoming or reducing or eliminating stigma is through this learning, is through this shifting our preconceptions and shifting our judgments about people and their identity. So next, what you're going to do is discuss the concept of reframing with your students. So for the purpose of the lesson, the definition of reframing that we are going with is changing our perspective on something to a positive understanding of that thing. So in order to facilitate this conversation around reframing, you can refer to our downloadable resource on diverse ability, and explain that when we're talking about language, like I said at the beginning of this video, one way we can reframe the conversation around disability is to instead say diverse ability. Disability has a connotation that can be perceived as negative. Diverse ability shows that while we might, someone like me who has a disability doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. It's saying it's diverse, it's different. It's not necessarily status quo, but it's not negative either. So something else to acknowledge in this conversation is language is very complicated, and some people prefer the term diverse ability, some people prefer the term disability. So we never want to make assumptions about the language that people prefer when you're referring to somebody who has a diverse ability or a disability. So I would encourage you to encourage your students to always ask. If they meet someone who has a learning disability and they're open to discussing it, say, you can ask them what term do they prefer? Do they prefer diverse ability or do they prefer disability? It's always important to have that dialogue when you're talking about language. So the active part of the lesson is where your students get to do this research assignment. So there is a list of famous people on the lesson plan who all have learning disabilities. So you can show this list to your students so that they can pick from that list. And when they're doing their research, I would encourage you to have them focus on specifically what that person's experience with their learning disability was. That information might not be super readily available on the internet. If they're having trouble finding information, that might be part of the conversation too. Why isn't there more information about this person's experience with their learning disability on the internet? Is it something that they might not feel comfortable talking about? Is it something that society isn't necessarily comfortable talking about in the context of these people that we admire? So, I think that's something that they can bring into their presentation if they decide to stick with the celebrity that they've chosen, regardless of how much research they can find. So once they've compiled a good amount of research on this person, and they can also do research on the specific learning disability that they have if it's one that they don't know particularly well. So example, if one of the celebrities has dyslexia. They can do a fair amount of research on what dyslexia is, because I think it's also very imperative that they learn about the disability, the learning disability itself, through this research process. So I would like them to focus specifically on the learning disability that this person has, and then about how that person has become successful regardless of the way that their brain is and potential limitations that they may have when it comes to their learning disability. So once they've done all of this research and they've created their presentation, they can present it to the class. So I think this is a really great opportunity for your students to learn from each other. So, they've all research different people, and they can do this in either pairs, individually, or small groups, depending on how many students you have, depending on how they work best. That is up to your discretion as their educator. But I think it's really great for students to learn from each other. So I think the presentation will be a really big component of this lesson for them. So they can, learn about a different learning disability, or learn about a different person who has a learning disability, and get a deeper understanding of different content areas through these presentations. And this is also where the English language curriculum competencies come into play. So they write the presentation, they deliver the presentation, and then they can have a dialogue afterward about each of the celebrities that they've chosen. They can ask each other questions about the learning disability, and hopefully they'll be a bit more of an expert on that person and their learning disability at this point, so they can answer those questions themselves. So that's it for the active component, and this can take as long or as little time as you see fit, depending on how much research they do, depending on how long you want the presentations to be. This is more of a loose skeleton of this part of the lesson, so you can really play with it and make it your own, depending on what your students want and what accommodations they may need. So, I always like to factor in, because of, this is all very important to be discussing, especially in the context of this lesson. So accommodations and modifications could be, working in partners if somebody is visually impaired and they can't use a computer. If they have a learning disability and they really struggle, they can, do talk to text feature on a computer when they're writing their presentation. And, any other accommodations that you might see fit for the students that you have in your class who have unique needs. So the lesson closure will kind of just tie everything back together, and is a way for you to wrap up this conversation around learning disabilities, around reframing our thinking about different people and, different identities and different needs and different abilities. So you can refer back to the board again and ask if, once again, their assumptions or their judgments or the preconceptions that they had at the beginning of this lesson may have changed till now. And you can also talk about it in the context of mental health, because, learning disabilities and mental health can often go hand in hand. I know for me, that's been a very personal experience that I have had. I've had a lot of anxiety that has come up surrounding my learning disabilities. So I think it's important to tie it back to that mental health component too, and saying that, when we're reducing or eliminating stigma of all kinds, mental health is a piece of that. There is a lot of mental health stigma, just like there is learning disability stigma. So the more we can learn about other people's lived experience, the more we can be reducing and eliminating the stigma that might exist surrounding those pieces of their identity. So that's about it. I think the last thing is just to explain to your students that when we see people for their strengths, not the things that could possibly limit them, we are empowering them and we are overcoming stigma. So that's the lesson for today. I hope you found it helpful, and I hope that you will use this lesson with your students. Once again, please feel free to leave a comment or a question or feedback or anything in the comments of this video. We will be back not next week, but the week after with another Stigma-Free Learning Live. Once again, I am your host, Samara Liberman. I am happy to have you here, and I hope to see you next week. Not next week, sorry, the week after.